Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for coming. I wanted to ask, how many of you aspire to be a writer? Oh, good, wonderful. That's great. So I want to talk to you a little bit about writing. And I've been a writer for 40 years, and I've written in many, many different genres and forms. Can you not hear me? Can you hear me? Really? I need to be a... Okay.
I can get a stand for you, sir, if you prefer stand.
Yeah, that might be nice. It's a little bit distracting. Okay, well, this is, I don't know. Let's see. Maybe it's better if I even, yeah. Okay. After all that. Anyway, I want to talk to you a little bit about writing. First of all, if you're interested in writing, this is a great thing, because really language separates us from animals. You know, this idea, the evolutionists have never been able to deal with this notion that apes can't talk. None of the other creatures in God's creation can talk except man, and this has always been the case. And so this idea that suddenly we descended from apes and then learned how to talk is a little hard to swallow. But anyway, that's another issue. It's what divides, it's what makes us human, is the ability to articulate and use language. So anyway, dealing in language is a world in itself, and to be interested in language and to be interested in writing is really to be interested in being human. This is how we communicate with each other. And there are, at the core of language is storytelling. Storytelling is fundamental to human interaction. And it's fundamental to almost every kind of writing. So it's something to keep in mind. It's what is engaging. Part of what's happened to Islam is that it's become academic, and which means that it's didactic. It's this, you do this, you do that, you do this. But there's a rich and deep tradition in Islam of storytelling. The Quran is comprised, among other things, of a series of stories, and the Hadith is an episodic story of the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So we live in a world of storytelling, and this is one of the ways that we engage people and teach people. It's very, very important. And this, to some extent, has been lost when Islam became an academic discipline. It became something you sit in a classroom and people tell you what you should be knowing. There's always been an aspect of that, but it's not like it is now. So, because everything was alive and organic, and people had problems, so they would go to a scholar and say, "I have a problem. What's the solution to it?" And he'd give them a solution. It's an interaction, a human interaction, and so in learning to be a storyteller is a very, very useful thing, and it's very good for the society. And if you have talent, it can be something to give you a very rich experience of life. There are, of course, two basic forms of writing nowadays. There's nonfiction, okay? Nonfiction writing is writing about what's real. And then there's fiction writing. And in many cases, nonfiction and fiction overlap and intersect. I mean, the great novelists of the 19th century, like Dickens, they wrote fiction, but it was based on nonfiction. It was based on real life. They did intense research. And what's happened, I mean, I should have brought along I may actually have a book. Anyway, Tom Wolfe, the writer, a very popular writer, in 2000, he wrote a series of essays called Hooking Up, about how the world was going digital, basically. He was looking into that. His whole point was that fiction writing and nonfiction writing are more or less the same, that they can be the same. And he was very disparaging about the popular novelists, like Norman Mailer at the time and other novelists who were becoming very precious and introverted, because he said, in the heyday of novels, the writing was based upon intense research of something real, not something in somebody's head or imagination or that sort of thing. So there's an intersection between fiction writing and nonfiction writing. And there are many, many kinds of writing. You can make a living as a writer. It's well within the realm of possibility once you look at how many kinds of writing there are: essays, short stories, biography, history, business writing. I was a business writer for many years, and business writing is a kind of storytelling. News writing, or they call a news report a story. It's a story. You can write about art, engineering, environment, film, sports, technology. There's academic writing. You can write film. You can write on film, and you can write film itself. Criticism, investigative stories, endlessly. There are so many possibilities in writing, and so it's a viable occupation. People always need writers. I was talking with someone this afternoon from the film industry here. And he was saying that when he had an encounter with Pixar, which makes the animated cartoons, he discovered that there were 30 writers on their movies. They have 30 people writing the movies. And that the most important dimension was not so much the visual side, it was the written side. Writers get the short end of the stick. There's a famous story of who's seen Lawrence of Arabia, the film Lawrence of Arabia? Okay, Lawrence of Arabia is an amazing film directed by David Lean. There's a famous scene in it where Peter O'Toole, who plays Lawrence, says, "I'm going into the desert," and he snaps a match, and the match goes into flame, and it becomes the sun. Right? They cut to the sun. And all the critics gave David Lean, they said, what a genius that he came up with this. He didn't come up with it. The screenwriter came up with it, Robert Bolt. He strikes a match, the match flame goes into flame, and it becomes the sun. And it's this incredible visual, but it was written. And so writing is incredibly, incredibly exciting and dynamic way to make a living. So I'm going to just talk about how you go about it, because sometimes you don't know. There's this cliche in movies where you see someone who's struggling to write, and there's an empty page, and then they write something, and then they erase it, and then they write something, and they have what they call writer's block. That's complete rubbish. First of all, you don't go to an empty page and just look at it. You've already done research. There's a whole process to writing anything. So what do you need to be a writer? Well, you need talent. Some people don't have that talent. I'll give you an example of my dearest friend, Peter Sanders, who's really one of our greatest living photographer. He's a great photographer. Can't write. He just can't. He can't put things in words. It's really, really, really hard for him. It's not his métier. His images are his métier. That's his world. And that's fair enough. So you need to discern whether you have some talent. And you can find that out in school. In school, do you get A's in your essays or you get F's? If you can't write, a school paper, it doesn't mean that you're not a writer. Maybe you're a genius, but you have to have some affirmation somewhere that you have some talent. You need a grasp of language. You need to love language. Language is I love language. I love words. It's just, and it's the thing, you remind yourself, it's the thing that makes you human. This is how you differ from a monkey, or, one of the other things too. We're not so hairy. And you need something to write about. You need to have something that you want to say. And a lot of people aspire to be writers, but they don't have anything to say, And sometimes, when you're young, it takes a certain amount of arrogance to be a writer. Because you say, well, I have something to say. Well, who are you? You're like 21 years old. You don't know anything, Well, but still, there are a lot of young people who have something to say. They feel that they have something to say. And so you need something to write about. And writers of fiction and nonfiction, they write about their lives. They tend to, especially fiction writers. They write about what they know. They don't write about things they don't know about. Actually, nonfiction writers do that more than fiction writers. Nonfiction writers will go out and into the world and learn something. Okay? Salam alaikum. Very good. Okay, so in order to do that, you need to find your direction. What is it that turns you on? What do you really get excited about? This is how you tap into, the direction you want to go as a writer. And then you have to also know what your limitations are. There are certain things you may want to do or not want to do. I'll give you an example for screenwriting, for example. If you're a screenwriter, it's a very tough, as a business, you need someone to produce your screenplay. So that means you have to be in that business. You have to live, if you want to be a big-time screenwriter, you really have to go and live in LA or something, which is I hate the place, it's just awful. But you have to live there because that's where these movies. If you're living in KL, you can write for the local cinema, But if you want to break it and make it big, you got to go to the place where there's work. You can be a novelist and live anywhere, because that's where. But you need to know what your limitations are. Do you want to do that? Is that really you want to go to that kind of trouble to do that sort of thing? Fact or fiction? Do you want to write a fact-based piece or a fiction, a story? The lady that was supposed to be here, Hannah Al-Kaf, she's written a story. I started reading it. I haven't read that far into it, but it's a really interesting book. Have you seen her book? I forget the name of it, but it's about a girl who is. The central figure is possessed by a jinn. Who makes her have OCD. It's a very weird, complicated character, and I was looking forward to asking her how she came up with that, because that's a really interesting idea. But you need to, but it's like it's a fiction that she's written, but it's based upon a real life. In 1969 there was a revolt? A riot, and it was based upon that incident. So, and what do you have to say? What is it that you want to say? You really need to have something that you need to say. And it can be something very simple about your life. It can be something very deep. Whatever it is, you need to have something that you have to say. Otherwise, why are you writing? And where do you find your inspiration? You need to be inspired. This is why I don't believe in writer's block. Writer's block is, there's a process. There's a point where you're not writing, you're thinking. There's a funny story about the movie mogul in the 1930s, Louis B. Mayer. He was the head of MGM Studios. And he would go past the writers' bungalows, and they'd all be silent. And he came back and he said, they're not working, because there was no typing, no typewriters going. I'm paying these people for nothing. They're not working. Well, they were thinking. That's part of what writing is. Writing is thinking. And, he didn't understand that. So he said, if they're not typing, they're not working. No, they're thinking about the plot for the movie and how they structure, and a lot of it is inward. It's thought. And part of what feeds that is something outside of you, inspiration, other people's writing, art, events in the news events. There are all kinds of ways of being inspired to write something. The world around you, another person, your mother, your father, your children. There are all kinds of inspirations for writing. So, and then to discover your voice, because initially when you start writing, you're probably imitating somebody else. You like a certain person's writing, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that at all as a beginning. During the 1920s and 30s, Ernest Hemingway was the dominant writer in American letters, and everybody imitated him, including John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck became far more successful ultimately than Hemingway, but he started imitating Hemingway because everybody did. Everybody wanted to write like Hemingway. So there's nothing wrong with that, because then as you write and continue to write, you develop a style, you develop a personality. There are words that you like, words that you don't. The way that you form a sentence, you create your own voice. It isn't artificial. It's something that happens by doing it. Okay. Most important thing, if you're starting out as a writer, read a lot. Read every day. Read. Love reading, because this is what will feed your own writing itself. You need to. And it's a skill reading. About 40 years ago, the University of California at Berkeley did a study of their students and discovered that 65% of the undergraduate students at the University of California were functionally illiterate. What they mean by that, what they meant by that, I think, is that they can read newspapers and signs and things, but they really didn't understand what they were reading. Because reading is a practice. It's the eye connects to the page, which then feeds the mind, and the mind processes language, and so on. If you stop reading, and the problem is we're living in an age now where nobody reads anymore. And if you don't read, you lose the ability to read. You lose the ability to grasp linguistic ideas and information with the eye and process it and so on, because you're not practiced. So you need to practice. So as aspiring writers, you need to read every day, all the time. Read what you love to read, whether it's a love story, or whether it's a sports story, or whether it's something on Islam, or whatever. I have several influences myself. I was deeply influenced by the writers Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene. I loved their writing, and they influenced me a lot. Also, I was influenced by Tom Wolfe, who is a fantastic social writer, and then he became a novelist later on. But the most important influence for me is the writing of Sufi awliya. That had a huge impact on the way I looked at writing and wanted to write, which is strange. So there's a kind of an interesting synthesis of influences that you can have. You put everything down. The way you start writing is you put everything down on paper. Everything. Just put all the junk, all your ideas, and then rewrite. Good writing is rewriting. There's a famous Jack Kerouac. I don't know if any of you have heard of Jack Kerouac. He is the famous beat writer who wrote a book that really changed the course of literature in the 1950s. It was called On the Road. It's actually, if you read it now, it's not that great. But anyway, he wrote this, famously wrote the book from beginning to end on a roll of butcher paper without going back. It just kept going. He wrote the whole thing from start to finish, never went back. And the writer Truman Capote, when he heard this, he said, "Oh, well, that's not writing, that's typing," because, that's not how you write. What you do is you work the language. Ernest Hemingway would spend one entire day on a single line, on a single sentence, working the sentence, working it. And so writing is a constant process of rewriting. So the first thing, and a lot of writers, novice writers, they think that they're supposed to write something beautiful the first time. No, you write junk. Most of it's junk. Then you work it. You get it down on paper. Then you structure it. And it goes like that. The other suggestion I have is read your writing out loud. If it reads well out loud, it's probably good. Sometimes writers get so snarled up in their mind, they'll write like a very complicated sentence and they can't say it. If you can't say it, someone will have trouble reading it. So it's a good way of simplifying the text, of making it very, very easy to say, and it usually improves the less you put into a sentence, the more effective. Although that's not always the case. If you look at the writing of Rudyard Kipling, which I like very much, his sentences are very complex, but they're fun, they're rhythmic. He really had a way of rhythm, but he wrote very long sentences. Now there's an art to writing, even business writing. I ran a public relations company for many years, and I wrote every day, but it was business writing. It was writing for clients, and so this could be very tedious. But I always took each one of these things as a little work of art, a press release, the most banal thing you can possibly think of, but you find a way to do it with a snap and make something. So you keep doing that. And professionals will tell you this in every business, is you do the best you can with what you have. I have a friend I started out with as an actor, who continued and has had a career for over 50 years. He's an old man now, and he plays old men, grandfathers, and characters like that. But I was with him. He was in a Broadway play, and he gave a talk to students after the performance, and they asked him about doing television. He said, "Well, you do the best you can. Some things are not very good. So if you're a writer for hire, you do what you can. You do the best you can, and what you want to try to do is avoid becoming what they call a hack, someone who has lost the feeling for the writing and just goes through the motions and does the least just to get paid." So writing is really an art. So to write something, you start with what you know or with what you want to know. I have a friend, Shams Friedlander. He's written about 12 or 13 books, and one or two of them have been in print for over 40 years. So he's a successful writer. And he told me recently, he's my neighbor as well as a very close friend. He said, "I'm lazy. So when I want to learn something, I write a book about it, So you can you can say, I really want to know about this. I wrote a book on India because I loved India and I wanted to travel all over India. So I wrote a book on India. It was an absurd idea. And it was, it didn't sell that many copies, but I loved it. I had a great time. And it's a good book. It's just that it was self-indulgent. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to travel over India, and I spent a year, all told, sort of going all over India. And it was amazing, great experience. You need to So you need to know what you need to start with something that you know, and I'll get into this later. But you need to, if you don't know something, you need to find out, and this is a very key dimension to writing. The other thing is you need to identify your audience. Are you writing for children? Are you writing for adults? Are you writing for Muslims? Are you writing for a general audience? Who are you writing for? Are you writing for adolescents, teenagers? You need to have an audience. Writers who say, well, I just write for myself. I don't want to read their stuff. I absolutely don't, because I know it'll be bad. I had a friend, a very dear friend, who was an heir to an oil fortune, a huge oil fortune. And he was a very humble guy, very modest, interesting character. He had a Malibu sort of mansion on the beach, which he rented out, and instead lived in a surfer's flat, sort of at the edge of Malibu. And he knew all these because he had a lot of money. He knew everybody. He knew Tom Wolfe. He knew Marshall McLuhan. He traveled all. He dated Svetlana Stalin. It was very weird. He was a really strange character. He had an interesting life. And he always talked about himself as a writer. He said, I wrote this, I did this, I did. So I assumed he was a writer. But by the time I knew him, he was actually doing some other things. He wasn't really writing. But he always talked about himself as a writer. And then I used to show him some of my writing, and he liked it and that sort of thing. And then one day he came out and he gave me a manuscript to a novel he'd written. And I was really happy, and I took it away, and my heart sank. It was awful. It was absolutely awful. Because it was just self-indulgent. It wasn't illiterate, it just was boring. Because he wasn't writing for an audience. He wasn't writing, you have an audience, how are you going to get to them? How are you going to get them on the hook? How are you going to keep them, reading so that they're fascinated? You have to, writing is a kind of a manipulative art. All art is like that. And I'll give you an example of painting. There's a famous incident I think it's the 19th century, between John Constable and Turner, they were the two great leading painters of their day. And Constable, if you see his paintings, they're almost like photographs. They're crisp and really beautiful, stunning. And Turner did seascapes and storms, and his painting is different. But they were the two reigning painters of their time. And they did a kind of a competition in the Royal Academy. And people would, it was a big deal, and everyone was following them, and they were looking at the painting. And the consensus was, Constable, he's nailed it. He's amazing. This painting is far superior to Turner's. And this is a true story. And Turner's painting was kind of murky and out of, and everyone said, he's not going to make it. And then at the very last minute, Turner looked, he stood back, he stuck his thumb in a red paint, and he splotched it in the middle of the canvas. And it was completely different. It was completely changed. And it's one of the great paintings. And, everybody saw it. There were gasps. And he just, this red, and the painting is in the museum in what is it? In London. No, not the Tate Gallery, the main gallery. I'm blanked out. Anyway, you can see this painting. It's fantastic. Anyway, so these are that's the fun part, where you keep you have an audience, and part of it is these guys painted for an audience. They had patrons. They had people that were willing to buy the paintings. This idea that art is this pure thing, and I'm writing for myself, that's nonsense. Mozart never wrote a single note of music except for money. He was a money machine. He was a prodigy. His father used him like that. And he was into money. He bought stuff, and he died poor. He died poor because he spent all his money. He loved buying stuff, and then his music went out of style, and he wasn't able to make money. But there was this idea that you do this, you're this pure artist. No, artists, they love what they're doing, but they also have to make a living. They have patrons. There have always been patrons and so on. So you identify your audience. You write for an audience. You write for a patron. Maybe one person wants to pay for what you have. So you write for that patron. You have an audience, and you have to determine what the audience will respond to. You look for inspiration. We talked about that already. And you talk it through with people you trust. Talk through the idea, because sometimes you go through an idea and ultimately you say, I don't want to do that, or you get a negative response. People say, well, that doesn't sound very interesting, and you think about it. So talk it through with people that you trust. And then you keep refining the idea and refining. Writing is an organic process, and it's only at the last minute when you put the red splotch at the very end that you know what you've got, And it's very satisfying when you're able to do something like that. This is very important, is research. Research is for writers, research is everything. Graham Greene was a great novelist. He went to incredible lengths to research his novels. He would go into the Congo, into Africa. He would go into Haiti during the revolution. Really dangerous places to get real information. And this is, and he was a fiction writer. He also did journalism as well. But research is everything. And I'll mention a very interesting book that talks about research. But research feeds into everything. So you should never be having this idea of writer's block. If you have writer's block, go and do some research. Read, get inspired. How many of you have researched something? Okay. Yes. Okay. It's really fun, don't you think? It's drudgery, but it's also incredible. It's like detective work, and it really is. It's absolutely amazing. You come across some piece of and it's you feel like Poirot or something. You feel like a detective. So it's a balance of drudgery and excitement in discovering something. I was researching a book on India, and I was in a Maharaja's library, and I came across this incredible letter that basically was from the British resident, saying that they had to protect the son of the Maharani from being assassinated, so they put him in a different place. It was really interesting, I felt like because it was this old yellowy piece of paper where he's just saying, transfer him out of the zinana into private because he'll be assassinated, And it was a very interesting, kind of demonstration of what was going on in those zinanas. Little children were, poisoned and that sort of thing, because the wives would be, or in the zinana, they'd be in competition to have their kid as the successor or something. So anyway, I got very excited about it. So, so also developing style. This is something that evolves over a period of time. And it's very important for the success of a writer that you have a style, that it's a recognized way of expressing yourself. And what I wrote here is it's an amalgam of literary aesthetics, temperament, form, genre, and the writer's inner voice. It's a whole basket of factors that go into writing. And in the beginning, everybody imitates or copies. And Picasso said, good artists copy, great artists steal. Now that's a very interesting thing, because you take something and say, well, I'll have that. If you're good at what you do, and you're not copying it, you're stealing it. You're saying, oh, I love that idea, I'm going to do it, but you're not copying it. By the time it's put in your form, it's something else. You've done it yourself. But the artists are ruthless thieves, filmmakers, writers, they'll steal from anything that looks good, that works. But it's sometimes you have plagiarism, but plagiarism is not as common among good writers. They don't need to do that. But stealing, yeah, everybody steals. It's great. Now, storytelling is the foundation, basically, of writing, in my view. E.M. Forrester wrote he delivered a series of lectures on the aspects of the novel, and he puts that down. He said this is the lowest form of the novel is storytelling, and he was very disparaging. In that time, Forrester was lecturing in the 1930s. I don't know. I can't remember exactly the dates, but anyway, he was of the generation that was trying to turn the novel into a sort of a deep psychological kind of study. He was saying that's the benefit of the novel. And what's happened is that has become the novel has almost died because of that, because it's not based on research anymore. It's all internal, mind thing, Tom Wolfe is very critical of that, and I tend to agree with him. I'm not very interested in novels. Like there was a novel. I don't read novels very often. I'm not interested in them. But I read a novel called Cold Mountain, which is a beautiful book. I mean, it's really beautiful. But if you step back and look at it, I think it's the Odyssey retold. Yeah. During the Civil War, he's just replaced it, and it's beautifully written. But it's the story that gets you. He uses all the same elements as Homer, but it's the story, and people are hoodwinked by the fact that it's in the Civil War and it's very beautifully written. It's a very nice novel. But it's the story that keeps you going. So storytelling is absolutely fundamental. And the way you start, like if you want to tell a story, is you need a hook, something that triggers the story. And I'll give you a funny, really interesting anecdote about that. I had a good friend in university by the name of Colin Higgins. And Colin was a graduate student in filmmaking, and he'd done a very well-received student film that was well done. But he was a pool cleaner in a mansion owned by a big movie producer who actually just died last week at a very advanced age, Eddie Lewis. He was his pool cleaner. And he lived in the little outhouse, on the grounds. And Colin wrote this screenplay. And the screenplay was to a film called Harold and Maude. And Harold and Maude has become a cult film, a classic at that time. But I was one of the two people that heard the first version of Harold and Maude. And he told the story, and we were just rolling around, hysterically laughing. And he told me that what gave him the idea, he started the whole thing because he had this idea for doing a shot of 2 feet, walking along, down and doing this and that and the other thing. Ultimately, it was 2 feet, getting on a chair, and then kicking the chair out, and the 2 feet hang. That was what his idea was. And then he wrote the whole thing based on that. That was his hook. That's what got him into the thing. And then, of course, what happened was Harold, who's this 19-year-old kid, he's hanging, and he looks like he's hanging. His mother comes in, and she looks up, and she says, "Oh, Harold." And she walks up, because he's like faking his suicide for his mother, because he wants her attention. And the story is about this 19-year-old boy who falls in love with an 80-year-old woman. So it's really bizarre. And it became a cult film. It's used in classes on screenwriting. The screenplay is great, and it was hilarious. But that's what got him into it. Something, just one thing, some idea. So you need to get into the story and find a good beginning, and then find your format, your métier. How are you going to do it? Are you going to do it in short chapters, long chapters? What works for you? What works for the story? And you need to know the world you're creating on paper. You need to know that world. This is where research comes in. It's one thing, if you write about, let's say, your hometown or your village or wherever you're from, go back there. Walk those streets again. Don't just rely on memory. Go back and get up close to that world. Become familiar with it, and then build tension and suspense and a narrative trajectory. You need to, where is this going? Because a reader will follow you as long as there's a dynamic, a movement forward. And this is what Forrester disparaged. He said these are page turners. That novels should be much more than a page turner. And he used as an example of that Sir Walter Scott, who was a hugely popular 19th century novelist, who wrote these almost like pot boilers, and you couldn't wait to get to the next page. What's going to happen next and next? Yes, but there is, you do need to keep the reader one way or another, psychologically, in terms of what's going to happen in terms of suspense, whatever. So you need to build that kind of trajectory. How is it going to go? Tell your readers something they don't know. Show them something they don't know. Bring them into a world. There's a whole genre of memoir writing. A memoir is different than an autobiography. And autobiographies are for famous people. You will read an autobiography of some famous person you're interested in, even if it's lousy, because you just want to know why they got married to so-and-so, and why they did this, and and a lot of autobiography is terrible. It's not even good. But you read it because you're interested in that person. But a memoir is a genre. Anyone can write a memoir, and a memoir can be incredibly exciting and interesting, because it brings you to a world that you don't know. It could bring you to, let's say Malaysia in the 1950s. It could bring you to a period of war, or something like that, something that we don't know about. So it's a very personal thing, but it's a world that you're entering with that person. And of course, creating characters, this is the biggest challenge for novelists. It's not as much of a challenge for nonfiction writers, because the characters are in front of you and you need to be accurate, but for a fiction writer, you need to, the advice most novelists give is that you never try to write a character based on a single person. You composite those characters. Because if you do that, you get trapped in that person, and it can stop the drama. You see what I'm saying? So you composite them. You take this character, that character, and you make a sort of a composite figure of a bunch of different people, and then you can play with them. You have more flexibility. Anyway, I don't write fiction, so I haven't had to do that. But this is what novelists advise that you do. A lot of them do. Then also, as I said, you put all the junk out. You put everything down on paper, everything, all the things, and then start getting rid of it. There's a friend of mine told me someone's walking by a big, huge mountain of horse manure, right? And there's a guy digging and digging and digging and digging, and the passerby stops and watches him for a long time, and he's digging and digging in this huge mountain of horse manure. Finally, he turns to the passerby and he said, "Well, there's got to be a horse in here somewhere," and that's kind of what it is you have all this horse manure that you're working, and inside there's a horse somewhere. And that's what you have to do, is you start peeling away all the junk. That doesn't work, and this is where it becomes fun. It becomes really, once you get all the junk done, once you've done all the research, which is tough, it can be very tedious and take a long time. Research can take a very long time. And once you get all that out of the way, and then you put all of the stuff down, then you start working the text and making it work and refining the language. And to do that, you get into a zone. And it's just like, almost a dream space where you're in that world and you're messing with it and you're making it better and better and better and better. And you stay there until you're done, if you can. I mean, most people, they have things like distractions and that sort of thing. But really, the best way to do it is to try to make a space. If you're writing, let's say, a book or something, or even an essay or anything, just get into that zone and do it and push through until you're finished. And even then, you won't be finished. You'll have to go over and edit and continue to refine. Everything has a beginning, middle, and an end. Remember that. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and an end. And somehow human beings are unsettled if you have something that doesn't have that structure. It's a kind of natural structure for narrative and for storytelling. There's a beginning, once upon a time. I worked for years writing a series of films, documentary films, and I worked with a really fine corporate film director, and he insisted that every film, I would start it with, "This is the story of." Everyone, he said, say that, "This is the story of." And it makes everything work. It's a story. This is the story of such and such. And these were, they had industrial kinds of things. They were stories. So you need to have a beginning, middle, and an end. And the ending is, for most writing, is very important. How do you leave the reader? You need to sort of give them a buzz, something that they put down the book, they put down the pamphlet, they put down whatever, and they really, they're happy about that. And this is true even in business writing. A lot of business writing is selling. You're selling an idea or a proposal or something. You want to leave them. We had a situation where we were working for Coca-Cola, and the relationship started going not very well. And my colleague was on a flight, and he ended up sitting next to the vice president of Pepsi-Cola. He said, "We've been looking for you guys," because we were we were killing it in the press. We were doing really well in the press for Coca-Cola, and Pepsi-Cola was upset because we were beating them. And so he met the guy from Pepsi on a flight, and he said, we've been looking for, and he told me then, he was very happy. I said, "We've got to have a meeting with them because we're going to get fired from Coca-Cola." So we set up a meeting, and we waited until we were suspended because we knew we were going to it was somebody in the organization that wanted us out. So we knew. So the day we were suspended, we pitched to Pepsi-Cola. And we gave the, typical, pitch thing. But the last image, I got an image that was by Seymour Quast, who is a very well-known illustrator. And it had a picture of Coca-Cola with someone putting, a billboard with Coca-Cola with, a sign maker rolling up another cola over Coca-Cola, and I dropped in Pepsi-Cola. And we just left them with that image, and they burst out laughing. And they came back and said, they went away, and they hired us on the spot. But they came back and said, aside from the last slide, this is also what we liked, So this is a form of writing in a way. You want to hit the audience. So it applies to business. It applies to everything. How has anyone seen the film Sully? This wonderful film by Clint Eastwood about the guy who landed on the thing. If you have a chance to see it again or see it for the first time, the last line is fantastic. The last line makes the whole movie, and I can't remember. Oh, I know. Is there anything you would have done differently? And the co-pilot says, yeah, I would have landed in July, because it was it's just a great line, ending line, and that was it. That's the end of the film. And it's just, that's a writer doing that, making that choice. So making these choices of beginnings, middles, ends, very, very important. And you need to build the characters. The characters have to be really interesting. And it's in the detail. It's what do they look like? How do they walk? How do they talk? You drill down and make detail. Get into detail. And this is particularly true of nonfiction writing. If you're going to write about something, bring these people to life. They're human beings. They have, something special about them. Find that thing. Also, as I said, good writing is rewriting. It's a process of editing what you're doing. It's a process of continuous refinement. It just goes on and on. It takes a long time to do these things. My doctor in London, she has a patient who's a very famous novelist, and I can't remember her name, but she's really famous. She reads her books through 70 times after they're done. 70 times. And they're novels, they're big. She goes through every word, every page, 70 times. This is because you miss things. It can be punctuation, but it can also be the way you say something, or just an adverb or whatever. And you need to go over and over and over the text. You build the narrative and you compress the language and you look for the punch. This thing that it gets the audience. It reaches the heart. It reaches the gut. It makes it exciting. And you cut out anything that impairs the narrative flow. One of the signs of a novice writer is that they want to put in everything. And what you need to know is what not to put in, what to cut. And the same thing is true with photographers. Photographers need to edit their photographs because not every photograph is good, but they get very precious about things. I love that photograph. No, what makes something work? Whatever works, do it. And again, to reiterate, read everything out loud. Does it read well? Is it easy to read? Is it easy on the tongue? It probably means that it's easy on the eye. And after all that, you can say, I'm a writer. Okay? That's it. Thank you. Oh, and these are books that I suggest. One very interesting book by Robert Caro is called Working. Robert Caro is a multiple Pulitzer Prize winning biographer who wrote famously a biography of a series of biographies on Lyndon Johnson. And he's written, I think he's written 5 books in 40 years. He'll spend 9-10 years on a book. And it's really about the extent of his research. And he's so well thought of because he really completely changed the idea of biography. Because what he would do is he would research the subject of the biography, but then he would research the people who were affected by that person. You know, people who were hurt, people who were helped. You know, he would go into the towns and local towns, and he'd spend years researching books. And this is why people have to, you know, in a professional situation, you know, the biggest advances for, at least when I was in the business, I'm kind of out of it, but the biggest advances for writing were for biographers, people who were doing literary biography or, you know, and that's because a good biography that is authentic and doesn't have mistakes it can be in print for decades. It can be, you know, become a standard text. But people, so, you know, writers would maybe they'd get £500,000 or $500,000. That sounds like a lot of money. But the way that the business works is you get 1/3 of that going in when you sign the contract. So it's $500,000, you get $150,000, $165,000, something like that. And that you have to support yourself on that for maybe 5 years. So it's not so much money anymore. So you finish 5 years, and then you get paid the other third when the book is, you know, is published. No, when you finish the text, you get the other third, and then you get the final third when the book is published. So in the end of the day, Tom Wolfe wrote a book called A Man in Full. It took him 11 years to research it. Now, he'd written another book called The Bonfire of the Vanities before that and made millions of dollars off of it, so he could afford it. But he said, you know, 11 years is a long time not to earn any money, you know. And he did that, and he was lucky because the book was successful. But this is what happened. So it's a you know, the finances are, you know. And now a friend of mine, he knows the head of Knopf Publishers in New York, which is one of the biggest publishers and oldest in the U.S. And this guy told my friend, we don't even look at a book unless it can become a movie. We don't even look, we won't consider, because people don't read anymore. They don't make any money off of books. If a book sells 50,000 copies, big deal. But if they can sell it as a movie, they can make millions of dollars. And that's, you know, that's what they think, that's what's happening with the business. But still in all, you can make a very good living if you're talented as a writer. It's a really good thing to do, so go for it. That's what I think.